Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Taylor. My partner Jacqueline and I today will be presenting to you International Entrepreneurship, Leveraging Internal and External Knowledge Sources. In this publication, the authors Stephanie Fernhaber, Patricia McDougall, and Dean A. Shepard explore the academic literature regarding international entrepreneurship in order to build on the existing framework and how to examine how new ventures can leverage both internal and external international knowledge in achieving greater internationalization. International entrepreneurship is the discovery, enactment, evaluation, and exploitation of opportunities across national borders to create future goods and services. Historically, international entrepreneurship and specifically new ventures are unique in how flexible they must be in overcoming the constraints around them, with resources being the main one. This is both tangible and intangible resources. This publication suggests that the ability to internationalize comes with first having a competitive advantage that allows the firm to conquer the additional costs and be an active competitor in foreign markets, and by second, acquiring and exploiting internal and external knowledge sources. As the publication title suggests, the focus is to look beyond the fundamental tangible resources needed to engage in successful entrepreneurship and shifts the focus onto the intangible resources such as international knowledge. In order to set the framework for us to understand this publishing, the authors exemplify a few key notions. The first is international knowledge. International knowledge can be considered successful beliefs and skills that organizations apply on an international basis. Historically, academia has focused on prior international experiences of the top management team, hereon known as TMT, as the main source of international knowledge. The greater the amount of TMT knowledge and experience, the more opportunity and likelihood of success due to increased credibility and efficiency. The authors point out that little research has been assigned to international knowledge sources outside a new venture's organizational boundaries. These external sources of international knowledge can be attributed to conquering the liability of newness and foreignness. Additionally, external sources are used to verify that the organization is on the right path for success. Furthermore, the authors emphasize the importance of focusing on knowledge sources beyond the TMT, because the international environment is forever changing and the value of their experience will decrease over time. In the author's research, they develop a knowledge-based model for internationalization in order to examine the external sources of international knowledge for 206 new ventures to further examine the leveraging of external sources and how internal knowledge plays a role in this process. The authors believe that this research is of extreme significance, first by talking about how the impact of knowledge and how it is deeply fundamental to theories of management, strategy, and internationalization. Second, they speak to how absorptive capacity is recognized as an organizational mechanism for integrating internal and external sources of knowledge. The author's work introduces a new framework to understand the knowledge integration process and demonstrates instead that new ventures with low-level internal knowledge were found to benefit more from the knowledge vicariously exploited through alliance partners and venture capital firms. Finally, before the authors begin to develop their hypothesis, they uncover a gap in the international entrepreneurship literature pertaining to the factors influencing a new venture to internationalize and therefore contributing to the growing body of entrepreneurship literature on new venture internationalization. The gap they find is that international new ventures cannot do it alone, but rather they must leverage the external sources. The authors begin this section by emphasizing that international knowledge is critical for international entrepreneurship when entering the foreign market, one of which is organizational knowledge. The authors source Anand's organizational definition, which is any information, belief, or skill that the organization can apply to its activities. They then build on this definition to define international knowledge as the information, beliefs, skills that organizations can apply to their internationalization activities. This knowledge is heavily reliant on past experience, and as suggested in upper echelon theory, managers are ultimately influenced by their backgrounds, which in turn cause the development of biases, values, and beliefs. The authors suggest that those ventures with larger amounts of international knowledge will likely achieve higher levels of internationalization through the identification of new opportunities. Evidence would suggest that there is a clear linkage between management's international knowledge and their ability to internationalize. This is backed by evidence and studies of both existing firms and smaller entrepreneurial ventures. In the international environment, new ventures are likely to face several challenges due to the constantly changing environment. New ventures will also not have the capability and resources to be able to research the international markets. These challenges can be solved by creating relationships with other organizations through their formal partnerships or informal contact. The authors then move on to discuss 3 external sources of international knowledge and their impacts. First, alliance partners, which are defined as cooperative inter-firm agreements that aim to achieve competitive advantages for each partner. This is believed to be obtained through the information and knowledge shared through the relationship. Haidt argued that the partners of a new venture provide the conduits, bridges, and pathways through which the firm can find and access external opportunities and resources. Additionally, the authors mentioned that strategic alliances are said to be of the most important source for innovation and new ideas, as well as critical source for attaining the tacit knowledge. The authors support these findings with several examples from previous research in academia and therefore forming their first hypothesis. With that knowledge in mind, the author's first hypothesis is the higher the international knowledge of a new venture's alliance partners, the greater the new venture's internationalization. With the author's first hypothesis formed, they moved on to look at the second external source of international knowledge, which is venture capital firms. Venture capital firms provide benefit beyond just finances. They bring significant management expertise, reputational benefits, employee recruitment, and strategy formulation. Another strong reason for this is because a venture capital has an invested interest in the success of that new venture. The involvement varies from new venture to new venture, but is dependent on how much intervention and support it needs in order to ensure success and profitability, while also considering where the venture capital firm's experience and strengths lie. With this knowledge, the authors then formed their second hypothesis. The author's second hypothesis is the higher the international knowledge of a new venture capital firm, the greater the new venture's internationalization. Finally, the third external source of international knowledge, proximal firms. This source of knowledge comes from what is known as knowledge spillover. Knowledge spillover is the sharing or acquiring of knowledge due to being closely located in the same geographical location as other leading multinationals operating in the same industry. Though this spillover effect is both best known in the technology industry, the authors believe it is still relevant to international knowledge. They support this belief by suggesting that the more firms within a new venture's headquarters location are international, the more opportunity for international knowledge spillover to take place to nearby ventures. This would then form their third hypothesis. The author's third hypothesis is the higher the international knowledge of proximal firms in a new venture's headquartered location, the greater the new venture's internationalization. With this knowledge in mind, the authors proceed on to further developing their model for understanding. International knowledge may not be directly due to a formal resource exchange, but instead believed to be an indirect benefit leveraged by the new venture's relationships. The authors continue this discussion by introducing 2 schools of thought that were put forward by previous literature as to whether the level of international knowledge of a new venture's TMT would benefit more or less from external knowledge sources. The first argument is that new ventures with experienced TMT might be able to better recognize and implement international knowledge. However, it is also said that new ventures with unexperienced TMT may have more motivation to overcome barriers and pay more attention to the external sources. In order to solve the argument, the authors develop a set of defending hypotheses to reflect and defend both schools of thought. First, they defend the more experienced TMT. To begin, the authors introduce what is called absorptive capacity. Absorptive capacity is the ability to recognize the value of new information, assimilate it, and apply it to commercial ends. The literature suggests that it is usually developed based on a firm's previous experience and knowledge base. This transfers well to the external sources of alliance partners, venture capital firms, and proximal firms in regard to how knowledge spillover occurs, because TMT with more experience will better be able to recognize opportunity, acquire new knowledge, and implement it. It would then suggest that new ventures with greater knowledge bases and experience have a stronger absorbed capacity for new information about foreign opportunities from external sources and be able to then implement it in order to internationalize. This then formed their first set of hypotheses. The first set of hypotheses are 4A. The positive relationship between the international knowledge of a new venture's alliance partner and new venture internationalization will be more positive for TMTs with greater international knowledge than for TMTs with lesser international knowledge. 5A. The positive relationship between the international knowledge of a new venture's venture capital firms and new venture internationalization will be more positive for TMTs with greater international knowledge than for TMTs with lesser international knowledge. 6A. The positive relationship between the international knowledge of proximal firms in a new venture's headquartered location and new venture internationalization is more positive for TMTs with greater international knowledge than for TMTs with lesser international knowledge. Second, they defend new ventures with less knowledge and experience by again reiterating that they would be more motivated to look to the external network for strategic direction. By having limited internal international knowledge, they must rely more heavily on their external sources to provide guidance on their strategic decisions. Moreover, the motivation to find and exploit international knowledge in their external environments would be greater. It is also said that the new ventures with less experience will find more benefit from these external sources, as they will have more questions and more voids to fill in their knowledge base. The literature also suggests that internationalization can occur both intentionally and unintentionally. Whatever the case, the knowledge gaps for new ventures with less experience are much larger and therefore making these new ventures much more aware and susceptible to finding external sources. This then would suggest that new ventures with less experience and knowledge are more motivated and benefit more from spillover of their external sources and be more aware of foreign opportunities identified through external relationships, therefore leading to their second set of hypotheses. The second set of hypotheses are 4b. The positive relationship between the international knowledge of a new venture's alliance partner and new venture internationalization will be less positive for TMTs with greater international knowledge than for TMTs with lesser international knowledge. 5b. The positive relationship between the international knowledge of a new venture's venture capital firms and new venture internationalization will be less positive for TMTs with greater international knowledge for TMTs with lesser international knowledge. 6b. The positive relationship between the international knowledge of proximal firms in a new venture's headquartered location and new venture internationalization is less positive for TMTs with greater international knowledge than for TMTs with lesser international knowledge. I will now pass you off to my partner Jacqueline, who will explain the remainder of this case.
Thank you, Kyle. We'll now talk about methodology, starting with sample and data. 227 high-technology new ventures that underwent an IPO between 1996 and 2000 were identified through the Securities Data Corp Global News Issues database. The sample size was then reduced to 206 as only firms that exhibited sales revenue in the year following IPO were returned in the sample to have a year lag time between independent and dependent variables. This resulting sample represented new ventures in 3 high-technology industries in 37 different metropolitan statistical areas throughout the United States. In terms of size, the average new venture achieved $185.47 million in asset and $53.72 million in sales at the time of IPO. Moving on to dependent variables, the data were obtained from the CompuStat North America and were used to conceptualize new venture internalization. First, we have international sales intensity. The international sales intensity of a new venture represents the performance dimension and is defined as the venture's degree of international involvement based on sales. It was operationalized as foreign sales as a percentage of total sales. Next, we'll talk about international asset intensity, which assesses the venture's degree of international involvement, taking into account the location of the venture's assets as of the year following its IPO. The variable was operationalized as foreign assets as a percentage of total assets. Next, we'll talk about international scope. The international scope variable considers the attitudinal and extent to which a new venture enters foreign markets outside its home region. This variable was operationalized using account of the number of continents a venture had sales in as of the year following the venture's IPO. An index of new venture internalization was also calculated based on factor analysis of the above variables. The Cronbach alpha for the composite measure was 0.86 and produced similar results in the regression analysis, offering additional support for the author's findings. Next, we'll talk about the international knowledge variables. Firstly, international knowledge of alliance partners. Alliance partners of a new venture were initially identified through the joint venture or strategic alliance database of SDC. This alliance partner of a new venture were deemed to have international knowledge if they were first headquartered outside the US or second headquartered in the US and had at least 10% of sales outside the states. So if a new venture had 5 alliance partners, but only 3 had international sales, a 3 would be entered for this variable. Next is international knowledge of alliance partners. Venture capital firms for each new venture were identified through Venture Economics Database of the STC, and firms that had invested in the new venture up until the initial public offering were considered. It was first assessed as to whether or not any international investments in current and past funds had been made, and then the count of venture capital firms with prior international investments were calculated. Moving on to international knowledge of proximal firms in headquartered location, the percentage of public firms that had reported international sales within the respective headquartered location of the new venture was calculated, and the metropolitan statistical area as a geographic unit of analysis was used. Moving on, international knowledge of TMT. The TMT is defined as the top executives of the venture and does not include external board members. The international experience of the new ventures TMT was assessed by examining the IPO prospectus for each venture. TMT mentors were coded as to whether they had international experience, 1 for yes and 0 for no. Next, we'll talk about control variables, starting with age. The age of the new venture IPO was determined from the founding data listed 306 in the STC's Global New Issues database and cross-validated within the new ventures prospectus. The size of the new venture was considered due to large firms having more resource availability that might influence its ability to internationalize. Delaware Incorporation, a dichotomous variable was created that distinguished whether or not the new venture was incorporated in the state of Delaware. Industry group, dummy variable, was utilized to control for the high technology industry group that the venture belongs and included the following industry groups: communications, computer equipment, and electronics. The size of the IPO was controlled by measuring the total dollar amount raised in the initial offering of stock. VC banking and alliance partner. Dichotomous variables were assessed as of the IPO year and called venture capital backing and alliance partners, respectively, to test the hypothesis relating to the international knowledge of the venture's venture capital firm and or alliance partner within the entire sample. R&D intensity to control the possibility of development of new product has been advanced as an important component of new venture internalization. The R&D intensity of the new venture was included in the model. IPO year. Dummy variables were also created to control the IPO year as the ventures identified in the sample had completed an IPO at various times from 1996 to 2006. Moving on to results, we'll first talk about descriptive statistics. We provide the descriptive statistics of the sample and an intercorrelation matrix. The mean age of the new venture was 3.64 years and ranged from 1 to 6 years. Nearly 48% of the new ventures in the sample had alliance partners, while approximately 79% of the ventures had venture capital backing. On average, the new ventures had 1.19 TMT members with international experience. This ranged from 0 to 8 TMT members. Of the 206 ventures, 106 reported international sales. The international sales intensity of the sample ranged from 0 to 100%, with a mean of 16.3%. In terms of international asset intensity, the sample ranged from 0 to 89.8%, with a mean of 10.2%. The international scope variable ranged from 1 to 6, with a mean of 1.99 continents entered. The venture capital backing variable is significantly correlated with the venture capital firms with international knowledge variable at 0.85. Also, alliance partner is significantly correlated with the alliance partners with international knowledge variable at 0.53. Next, we have regression results. For the international sales intensity and international asset intensity dependent variables, we used interval regressions to test the hypotheses. Interval regression takes into account the left censoring of the variables, as slightly less than half the new ventures in the sample did not have any international sales or assets. It is a robust form of the Tobit regression, and the results are comparable to using a two-step Heckman regression. To international knowledge of proximal firms in headquartered location variable is based on the geographic location of the new venture. As the resulting database is comprised of new ventures that are nested within geographic locations, the observations are no longer independent, which could lead to biased results from correlated standard errors. To address this concern, we ran the interval and Poisson regression analysis using the cluster option within Stata. For each internationalization-dependent variable, we tested two regression equations. The first contained the control variables and international knowledge variables. The interaction terms were then introduced in the second model. Each variable was mean-centered prior to entering each regression. The mean-centered variable were also used to create the interaction terms. We present the results of these tests in the table 2. Moving on to international sales intensity. Hypothesis 1, which proposed that the higher the international knowledge of alliance partners, the greater the venture's international sales intensity was supported. We also hypothesized that the higher international knowledge of venture capital firms, the greater the new venture's international sales intensity. Our findings provide support for this hypothesis. The international knowledge of other firms in a new venture's headquartered location was also found to be positively related to new venture international sales intensity. This finding provides support for hypothesis 3. To determine the nature of the relationship, we plotted high and low levels of TMT international knowledge on a y-axis of international sales intensity and an x-axis of the number of alliance partners with international knowledge. As illustrated in Figure 1, a new venture's international sales intensity increases with the number of alliance partners with international knowledge, but increases at a faster rate for those new venture TMTs with low international knowledge than those with high international knowledge. Thus, hypothesis 4b is supported. The TMT venture capital international knowledge interaction term was negative and also significant. This relationship is plotted in Figure 2. The new venture's international sales intensity increases with the number of internationally knowledgeable venture capital firms and increases at a faster rate for those new venture TMTs with low international knowledge than those with high international knowledge. Thus, support is achieved for hypothesis 5b. The TMT proximal firm international knowledge interaction term was negative but not significant. Thus, neither hypothesis 6a nor 6b is supported for international sales intensity dependent variable. Moving on to international asset intensity, in terms of external sources of international knowledge, we found a positive relationship between the international knowledge of alliance partners and the new venture's international asset intensity. This finding provides support for hypothesis 1. We also found a positive relationship between the international knowledge of venture capital firms and a new venture international asset intensity, and a positive relationship between the international knowledge of proximal firms in the new venture's headquartered location and the international asset intensity of the new venture. These findings provide support for hypothesis 2 and 3 respectively. Since the coefficient for the TMT alliance partner international knowledge interaction term was negative and significant, we again used a plot to reveal the relationship. Figure 3 illustrates that a new venture's international asset intensity increases with the number of alliance partners with international knowledge, but increases at a faster rate for those TMTs with low international knowledge than those with high international knowledge. These findings here provide support for hypothesis 4b. The coefficient of the TMT venture capital international knowledge interaction was negative and significant. As we illustrate in Figure 4, a new venture international asset intensity increase with venture capital firms' international knowledge, but increases at a faster rate for those TMTs with low international knowledge than those with high international knowledge. This finding provides support for hypothesis 5b. The TMT proximal firm international knowledge interaction term was negative but not significant, and thus did not provide support A or 6b. International scope. The higher the international knowledge of a new venture alliance partners, the greater the international scope of the new venture. We found that this relationship was significant, offering support to hypothesis 1. We did not find a positive relationship between the international knowledge of venture capital firms and the new venture's international scope, and a positive relationship between the international knowledge of other firms in a new venture headquartered location and the new venture's international scope. These findings provide support for hypotheses 1 and 3 respectively. As Figure 5 illustrates, a new venture's international scope increases with the number of internationally knowledgeable alliance partners, but increases at a faster rate for those new venture TMTs with low international knowledge than those with high international knowledge. This finding provides support for hypothesis 4b. As Figure 6 illustrates, a new venture international scope increases with internationally knowledgeable venture capital firms, but increases at a faster rate for those new ventures with TMTs that have low international knowledge than those with high international knowledge. This provides support for hypothesis 5b. The coefficient for the TMT proximal firm international knowledge interaction term was also negative and significant. Figure 7 depicts this relationship. The international knowledge of proximal firms in a new venture's headquartered location is positively associated with international scope. However, the relationship is more positive for new ventures with lesser internationally knowledgeable TMTs than more internationally knowledgeable TMTs. This findings provide support for hypothesis 6b. Moving on to discussion, first we'll start with the external sources of international knowledge. The results confirm that new ventures are able to benefit from having more alliance partners with international knowledge. A contribution to this study is the recognition of an additional alliance outcome pertaining to the transfer of internalization knowledge. The new ventures that were funded by venture capitalists, whose portfolios had higher percentage of international investments, exhibited greater internalization as the ventures appear to have been able to draw from the international knowledge of their venture capital firms. Thus, we add the transfer of international knowledge to the growing list of ways in which venture capital firms influence their portfolio companies. When a new venture are headquartered in a location where other firms are competing in international markets and thus are knowledgeable about such markets, the results suggest that this knowledge is likely to spill over and be exploited by new ventures located therein. This study makes a contribution to the economic geography literature by pointing to the possibility that other types of knowledge, such as international knowledge, can also spill over within close geographic proximity and serve to benefit firms located nearby. New ventures are not necessarily internalizing alone, but rather via a network they are creating. Together, these findings imply that although the resource-based view traditionally assess only the resources located internationally to a firm as contributing to their competitive advantage, the resources located externally can be important and valuable as well. Internal and external sources of international knowledge complements or substitutes. We argue that new ventures need international knowledge to benefit from external sources of international knowledge. This implied that new ventures with highly internationally knowledgeable TMTs would benefit most in terms of internationalization from external sources of international knowledge because they have the capacity to recognize and exploit the knowledge more effectively. On the other hand, we also argued that new ventures with less internationally knowledgeable TMT would be more motivated to overcome this shortcoming through a great reliance on external sources of international knowledge. Our results concurred with the later set of hypotheses. The results were fairly consistent for each of the three internalization dependent variables. This is a key contribution to the international entrepreneurship literature as it suggests an important way for new ventures to make up for gaps in their resource bundles. Moving on to managerial and public policy implications, the most evident source of developing a new venture's international knowledge base lies in top management team of the new venture. As new entrepreneurs assemble their TMT's, attention to whether or not a manager possesses international knowledge is an important consideration for ventures that desire to compete internationally. However, it is important for managers to also recognize the importance of looking beyond the TMT, as much more knowledge exhibits outside the organizational boundaries. Our results suggest entrepreneurs considering internationalization should also become effective at tapping external sources of international knowledge. For ventures who have alliance partners and ventures capital firms, their managers should seek to assess valuable knowledge from these external sources. The study also highlights the importance of choosing a location for the venture. For new ventures with top management, teams that lack international experience should make the internal resource limitation not necessary, which preclude the new ventures from internalization. Thus, new ventures with lower levels of international knowledge can tap external sources of international knowledge to compensate for their internal resource gap. This result also provides insight for public policy makers as country boundaries become more blurred and the need to consider international market increases. Policymakers are looking for new ways to encourage internalization by new and small firms. The results suggest policymakers may be able to help facilitate internalization through recognizing the new ventures may benefit from exposure to external sources of international knowledge. Limitations in future research. Limitations. The question of whether our findings generalize to ventures operating in industries that are not high technology or to ventures headquartered outside the US remains. Moreover, the use of publicly held firms results in an elite survivor sample, as the sample does not include new ventures that failed or new ventures that did not do an IPO within the first 6 years. Additional testing using other sample is necessary. A limitation of our study is that we were not able to include international entry year as a control variable in the analysis due to data limitations. Although the article examines factors leading to internationalization, we do not examine whether or not internalization was a good decision lead to superior performance. We are also not able to completely rule out that there is a reverse causality or that the internationally equipped partners or proximal firms are not simply a symptom of new ventures' international activity. We also limited the external sources of international knowledge to a new ventures alliance partners, venture capital firms, and firms in its headquartered location. Future research. Future research could test our model in a sample of new and mature firms and test for differences. Research opportunities also exist by exploring the impact of location in more depth. We operationalize the international knowledge of proximal firms at the MSA level of analysis. It would be interesting to investigate the influence of proximity using fine-grained measures. Research by investigating the antisense of internalization rather than to offer other study about the performance implication of internalization. While many have had internalization as an independent variable, we have it as an dependent variable. We believe that we make an important contribution by exploring the antisense of internalization relating to the international knowledge. Nevertheless, future research could more thoroughly examine the implied internalization performance relationship in the context of external knowledge transfers. Future research could also benefit if it examined how external sources of knowledge impact a new venture's country location decision, taking into consideration country differences. It would also be beneficial to examine the impact of other attributes of the external partners, such as their reputations, on new venture internalization. In conclusion, we investigated both internal and external sources of international knowledge on new venture internalization. We found that the international knowledge of new ventures alliance partners, venture capital firms, and firms in the headquarter location were positively associated with the venture's level of internalization. Contrary to the observative capacity arguments, these external sources of knowledge compensated for lower internal sources of international knowledge in new ventures internalization efforts. Now I'll hand over to Kyle for the impact into the Canadian market.
With these findings and knowledge in mind, new startups and ventures that are domestic to Canada with a desire to internationalize should look to secure a top-tier management team with ample amounts of previous international experience in order to maximize their internationalization opportunity. In addition to their own management team, they should employ a venture capital firm with the right connections and the right international knowledge in order to find the market to help create first-stage relationships and market opportunities. The new venture should look to the geographical location of their choice for existing businesses operating to somehow the same industry for any potential knowledge spillover so that they can leverage it for the best chance of success. Finally, new ventures should utilize the motivation of new startup members to identify any existing gaps or opportunities in their desired market.